Most of us have heard the name Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. We know about the terror he caused, but that's really only half the story. Today, we're going to dig into what happened after his capture, the huge, complicated legal case that really put the American justice system to the test.
Okay, let's go back in time. The year is 1985, and we're in Southern California. But this wasn't your typical summer of sunshine and beaches. No, this was a summer defined by this creeping, paralyzing fear. A series of incredibly brutal crimes was unfolding, and they seemed totally random. People were locking themselves in their homes, just wondering who's going to be next.
For over a year, this shadow figure, who the press dubbed the Night Stalker, was terrorizing the state. The attacks were vicious, the motive wasn't clear at all, and it seemed like anyone could be a target. It created this atmosphere of panic that was just unlike anything the area had ever seen.
But, as the attacks kept happening, investigators started to see through all the chaos. While the victims and the places seemed random, a pattern, a very distinct pattern, started to emerge. It was like a signature, left behind at scene after scene, that helped police realize they weren't chasing a bunch of different criminals. No, they were hunting one man.
And just look at the timeline here. It's absolutely chilling. The attacks just escalated so dramatically during that summer. It went from assaults to murders, and the killer was working with this terrifying speed. Sometimes he'd strike multiple times in a single week. So these clues, they became the killer's calling cards. At crime scenes, investigators kept finding shoe prints from a specific brand, Avia. The weapon was usually a small caliber gun, and then you had the really disturbing signatures. Homes were torn apart, and, chillingly, he would drop pentagrams on the walls. These were the details that were so crucial for linking all of these dozens of crimes together.
The big break in the case finally came on August 30th. Law enforcement had a suspect, and they released Richard Ramirez's mugshot to the public. And what happened next was incredible. The very next day, the manhunt came to a dramatic end. But it wasn't in some shootout with police. It was on the streets of East LA, where a group of regular citizens recognized him from the papers and captured him themselves. The reign of terror was over, but a whole new chapter was just getting started.
So with the killer caught, everything shifted from the streets to the courtroom. And this brought up a massive question for the whole legal system. After all those months of non-stop media coverage, was it even possible for the most infamous man in California to get a fair trial? And the scale of this challenge was just immense. A survey of potential jurors in LA County found that over 94% of them had already heard of the case. I mean, think about that for a second. How do you find 12 people to serve on a jury who haven't already heard the story and maybe haven't already made up their minds? Even the court knew what a problem this was. This quote here is directly from the case files. The judge himself used the word saturation to describe the media frenzy. It wasn't just in the news. It was a constant, overwhelming presence on TV, on the radio, in every newspaper.
So naturally, Ramirez's defense team argued for a change of venue. They said, look, there is no way we can get a fair trial in LA with all this media coverage. But the court actually disagreed. Their ruling was that LA County was so big and so diverse that they could find impartial jurors. The court also pointed out that almost a year had passed since the arrest, which they felt had helped cool things down. So the trial was staying right there in LA.
All right, so now we get to the trial itself. It was long, it was complex, and it led to the jury's verdict. But what happened after the guilty verdict was maybe one of the most bizarre and unprecedented moments in the entire case, and it all went down during the penalty phase.
43. On September 20th, 1989, that's the number of counts Richard Ramirez was found guilty on. All 43 counts, we're talking 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 14 burglaries, 4 rapes. It was just a total, sweeping conviction.
So once his guilt was established, the trial moved into its final stage, the penalty phase. This is where the jury has to decide between life in prison or the death penalty. And usually, the defense presents what's called mitigating evidence. Testimony from family, stories about a tough childhood, basically anything to argue for mercy. But this trial was anything but usual. The defense made a really stunning tactical choice. They presented absolutely nothing. No witnesses, no pleas for mercy, no evidence at all arguing for their client's life. And this exchange right here, taken straight from the court transcript, is just extraordinary. Ramirez's own lawyer asks him, on the record, if he agrees with the decision not to present any evidence to save his life. And Ramirez, cool as you like, just says, yes. He personally waived his right to fight for his life. Unsurprisingly, the jury sentenced him to death.
But the verdict wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The case of People v. Ramirez would actually spend decades tied up in the appeals process, and it left behind this complex legal legacy that we're honestly still grappling with today.
It actually wasn't until 2006, that's almost 17 years after the conviction, that the Supreme Court of California finally affirmed the original judgment. After going over every single aspect of the case, from the media coverage to that bizarre penalty phase, the state's highest court concluded that, yes, Richard Ramirez had in fact received a fair trial.
But the central question this whole case brings up, well, it's still out there. It forces us to ask, in our world of 24-hour news and intense public scrutiny, how does our legal system protect the rights of the accused? When a trial becomes a national spectacle, like this one did, can justice truly be served, or does the sheer weight of public opinion just inevitably tip the scale?